At our golden wedding anniversary, my husband announced he was divorcing me, and our 2 sons applauded. I calmly placed my ring on the table and said loudly, "Clap louder, boys. But you should know your real father is sitting at the next table." A deathly silence hung over the hall, and then a man stood up. The gold band on my ring finger didn't feel like jewelry today. It felt like a scorching hoop of iron. The engraving 50 years on the inside of the metal seemed to be branding the number right onto my skin. Lucille sat at the head of the massive table, maintaining that same flawless posture that all the women in their social circle envied. Her back was straight, her chin slightly raised, her gaze calm and benevolent. None of those present guessed that every breath she took was a struggle, as if the corset she had worn all her life had suddenly been tightened until her ribs crunched. The banquet hall of the Holloway estate was drowning in flowers. Huge bouquets of white lilies stood everywhere, and their heavy sweet aroma mixed with the salty scent of the Atlantic Ocean, which seeped through the partially open terrace doors. For the guests, it was the smell of luxury and success. For Lucille, it was the smell of a crypt. She swept her eyes across the room. The entire elite of Charleston was gathered here. Vance's business partners, old family friends, local officials, and even a few journalists whom her husband had invited to capture this triumph of family values. They all drank expensive champagne, made toasts about loyalty and love, and admired how Vance and Lucille had managed to preserve their marriage for half a century. "What a couple!" came a whisper from a nearby table. "So many years together and not a single scandal. Lucille is simply a saint." Lucille barely smiled with the corners of her lips. A saint? If only they knew. All her life she hadn't been holy. She had just been convenient like an old armchair that is a pity to throw away, but which no one pays attention to anymore. Her gaze slid to her husband. Vance sat nearby, lounging arrogantly against the back of his chair. At 72, he looked excellent. His silver hair was perfectly styled. The expensive dark chocolate suit fit him like a glove. He was laughing at someone's joke, throwing his head back slightly, and Lucille knew that laugh by heart. It was the laugh of a man convinced the world revolved around him. 50 years. For 50 years, she had said. "Yes, Vance. Of course, Vance. You are right, Vance." She had been his shadow, his secretary, his nanny, and his lightning rod. She polished his reputation as diligently as the staff polished the silverware in this house. Lucille's gaze shifted to her sons. Raymond and Stanley sat to the right of their father. Grown men, 46 and 44 years old. Both already had a touch of gray at their temples, expensive watches, and that same self-assured, slightly disdainful curve of the lips as Vance. They were whispering about something, casting short, indifferent glances at their mother. To them, she was something like a piece of furniture, necessary for the background but completely useless in essence. Memory, treacherous and sharp, suddenly transported Lucille back more than 40 years. She remembered this same room. Only then the furniture was different, and rain was pouring outside the window. Raymond was 3 years old. He had broken Vance's favorite vase. Her husband didn't bother to figure out what happened. He simply struck Lucille across the face, saying it was her fault for watching the child so poorly. Lucille hadn't cried then. She silently picked up the shards of the vase, powdered the red mark on her cheek, and came out to the guests that evening with a perfect smile. She thought she was saving the family. She thought she was protecting her sons from their father's anger by taking the blow herself. What a fool I was, she thought now, watching Raymond pour himself another glass of cognac. She hadn't saved them. With her silence, with her endless patience, she had raised monsters. They saw how their father treated their mother and learned one simple lesson. Only strength deserves respect. And in their eyes, Lucille was weak. The waiters began serving champagne for the main toast. The hum of voices in the hall quieted down. The musicians on stage stopped playing, and an expectant silence fell. Everyone was waiting for the speech from the man of the hour. Vance stood up slowly. He took the microphone, looked around the hall with the air of an emperor and smiled. But that smile didn't reach his eyes. Lucille felt something tighten inside her. A chill of foreboding ran down her spine. She knew that look. That was how he looked when he was about to buy a new car or fire the gardener. "Dear friends," Vance began, and his voice, trained by years of speaking at board meetings, filled every corner of the room. 50 years. Half a century. That is a huge amount of time. Many of you today spoke about patience, about sacrifice, about how important it is to preserve the family. He paused, enjoying the attention. Everyone looked at him with adoration. Lucille looked at her plate, feeling her heart start to beat somewhere in her throat. I listened to you and I thought, Vance continued, and his tone changed. It became harder, drier. Why? Why do we spend our one and only life trying to meet other people's expectations? I gave everything to this marriage. I worked. I built this empire. I provided for the family. Lucille was. He made a vague gesture toward his wife without even looking at her. A good companion, reliable. Someone in the hall sighed with emotion, but Vance suddenly straightened up and his face became cold. But at my 72 years I realized one thing. I am tired of pretending. I am tired of living in the past. I want to live the rest of my days honestly. I want to feel alive, not like a museum exhibit next to. He stumbled for a second, choosing the word. Next to memories. Lucille looked up. Vance was looking straight ahead over the heads of the guests. Therefore, today on this significant day, I want to make an important announcement. I am filing for divorce. The silence in the hall became not just deathly. It became a vacuum. It seemed as if the air had been pumped out of the room. Someone's fork clattered against a plate. A woman at the next table covered her mouth with her hand. Yes, you heard right. Vance's voice sounded firm, even challenging. My lawyers have already prepared the documents. I met a woman who understands me, with whom I feel young. I think I have earned the right to happiness after so many years of duty. Lucille sat motionless. She felt the blood draining from her face. Not from shame or grief, but from shock. He did this here in front of everyone. He decided to humiliate her publicly, to turn their golden wedding into a farce, a one-man show. She expected someone to be outraged, for one of their old friends to stand up and tell Vance he had lost his mind. But the guests were silent, exchanging confused glances, and then a sound rang out. Clap, then another. Lucille slowly turned her head to the right. Raymond and Stanley were standing. They were applauding. There was no shock on their faces, no sympathy for their mother. They were smiling. Bravo, Dad, Raymond said loudly, raising his glass. Finally, a man's decision. About time, Stanley chimed in, and his laugh, short and barking, cut Lucille's ears more painfully than her husband's words. Enough of this hypocrisy already. The guests, seeing the son's reaction, began to whisper uncertainly. Someone even giggled nervously, trying to adapt to the mood of the masters of life. Lucille felt as if her skin had been flayed off. Her own children, the boys whose scraped knees she had patched up, whom she had tucked in with blankets, for whom she had endured their father's coldness and cruelty. They didn't just betray her. They were enjoying her humiliation. Vance nodded contentedly to his sons and sat down, draining his glass in one gulp. He didn't even look at his wife. For him the question was closed. The old thing was thrown away. The new life had begun. Stanley leaned toward his mother. He smelled of expensive cologne and cognac. He brought his face so close to her ear that she felt the heat of his breath. Well, Mom, he whispered, and there was so much venom in his voice that Lucille felt physically ill. Finally, we won't have to pretend we respect you. Lucille stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over her heavy chair. Her legs wouldn't obey. Her knees were trembling, but she forced herself to walk, not to run. Running would be an admission of defeat. But to walk, preserving the remnants of her dignity, although inside everything was screaming and writhing in pain. She walked through the hall, not seeing faces, not hearing the whispers that rose in a wave behind her. The only thing she felt was Stanley's burning gaze boring into her back. She pushed the heavy glass door and burst out onto the terrace. The cold Atlantic wind hit her face, instantly drying the sweat on her forehead. Here in the dark, away from the light of crystal chandeliers and fake smiles, she finally allowed herself to breathe. The air was icy and salty. Lucille walked to the stone parapet, gripped it until her knuckles turned white and bent double. The first sob escaped her chest with a sound as if something inside had cracked. It wasn't the crying of an offended woman. It was the howl of a wounded animal cornered in a trap. Tears flowed down her cheeks, washing away her powder, settling into her wrinkles, dripping onto the cold stone. She wasn't crying about the divorce. The divorce was a deliverance. She was crying for the 50 years she had single-handedly laid on the altar of this monstrous idol of the Holloway family. She cried for the 20-year-old Lucille she had killed half a century ago, the girl with the long braid and laughing eyes who loved reading poetry and dreamed of becoming a literature teacher. Where was she now? Dissolved, disappeared, erased under layers of "Yes, Vance. Of course, Mom. As you say, Dad." Memory, ruthless and precise, threw her back to the summer of 1974. The smell of wet asphalt, the sound of rain on the tin roof of the gazebo in the old park. And Arthur. His rough, warm palms smelling of earth and pine resin, his quiet voice. "Lucille, don't go. We'll manage. To hell with their money." But she had been afraid. Afraid of her parents' anger, who had already made an arrangement with the wealthy Holloway family. Afraid of poverty, afraid of shame. And she chose prudence. She chose the golden cage, thinking she could learn to love the jailer. And then the boys were born and she committed her second crime. She decided she had to give them everything she didn't have. Status, a name, pride. She lied to them from day one. She lied to Vance, allowing him to consider himself the patriarch and creator of a dynasty. She lied to herself, convincing herself it was a lie for good. For the sake of the children, she whispered to herself at night when Vance returned in the morning smelling of strange perfume. I endure this for the sake of the children. And here they were, those children. Raymond and Stanley, grown men, applauding a father who was humiliating their mother. They weren't just like Vance. They were worse. Vance was at least honest in his cruelty. He never loved her and didn't hide it. But the sons, they grew on her love like parasites, sucked out all the juices, and now laughed at the empty shell. Another sob twisted her body. Lucille slid down to the cold floor of the terrace, pressing her cheek against the rough stone. She didn't care that her expensive dress would get dirty, that her hair would come undone. She felt dirty from the inside. I did this myself, the thought pounded in her head. I molded these monsters myself. I was silent when they were rude to the staff. I was silent when, as teenagers, they laughed at poor classmates. I thought they would outgrow it. I thought it was Vance's genes. No, it was my silence that gave them permission to be scoundrels. The wind fluttered the hem of her dress, but the cold no longer penetrated inside. There, where a fire of pain had just raged, something else began to form, cold, heavy, and absolutely clear. Emptiness. Lucille stopped crying just as suddenly as she had started. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up, leaning on the parapet. Her legs no longer trembled. Her head cleared as if someone had turned off loud, irritating music. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the door. An old woman with runny mascara and red eyes. But in those eyes there was no longer fear. There was the emptiness of scorched earth. She lowered her gaze to her hand. The golden ring gleamed dully in the moonlight. 50 years she had worn it like a medal for service. Now it felt like shackles, heavy, pressing, alien. You want freedom, Vance? She said quietly into the void. Her voice was hoarse but firm. You'll get it, but not the kind you're counting on. She realized she could no longer protect this lie. The legend of the Holloways was a rotten house built on a swamp. And if they were so proud of this house, if they valued their breed and name so much, let them see what their foundation was actually made of. Lucille took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. Her chest filled with icy air. She felt strange, as if she had died and been born again in the same minute. There was no more fear, no more shame. Only a cold determination to see the matter through to the end. She would burn it all down and let the fire cleanse this place. She turned to leave, but something made her linger, looking at the garden spreading out below the terrace. There, among the neatly trimmed bushes and statues, it was dark, but one silhouette stood out against the light gravel of the path. A man stood motionless, hands shoved into the pockets of an old jacket. He wasn't looking at the windows of the banquet hall where the merriment continued. He was looking up, straight at the terrace, at her. Lucille's heart skipped a beat. She would recognize that figure out of 1,000. Slight stoop of the shoulders, tilt of the head, the calm, patient posture of a man who knows how to wait. Arthur. He wasn't on the guest list. No one invited him, but he was here. The only person on this earth who didn't applaud her humiliation, the only one who knew the real her. And the only one who had the right to judge her but never did. He stood in the shadows like a silent reproach, like a living reminder of what she had lost, and what she had betrayed. But now looking down at him, Lucille didn't feel guilt. She felt the last piece of the puzzle fall into place. Fate hadn't brought him here by accident. The time had come. Lucille turned away from the railing and stepped toward the door. She was returning to the hall, but not as a victim, as a judge ready to read the verdict. Lucille threw open the doors to the hall with both hands, and that sound, the sharp, confident slam of the sashes against the stoppers, made several heads turn in her direction. She walked indifferently than she had walked out. That stooped, shuffling gait of a woman afraid to intrude on someone else's space had vanished. Now she walked with a measured stride. It was as if every strike of her heel on the parquet floor drove a nail into the coffin lid of their former life. The hall buzzed like a disturbed hive. Guests had broken into small groups, hungrily discussing the scandal. Some shook their heads sympathetically. Others openly gloated, anticipating the details of the division of property. But at the sight of Lucille, conversations died down, giving way to a tense silence. She walked through this gauntlet of eyes, not lowering her head, not hiding her tear-stained face. She had nothing left to hide. Vance was no longer sitting in his seat. He stood at the edge of the table, leaning nonchalantly on his elbow, whispering something into the ear of a young woman in a shiny champagne-colored dress. She giggled, covering her mouth with a hand sporting long scarlet nails. It was his secretary Vanessa, 25 years old, ambitions the size of this banquet hall, and a complete lack of conscience. Lucille had known about her for 6 months but remained silent. Now that silence seemed like a crime against herself. Her sons, Raymond and Stanley, stood nearby, sipping cognac and condescendingly watching their father. Seeing their mother, Raymond rolled his eyes and sighed demonstratively loud. "Oh, she's back," he threw to his brother, not even lowering his voice. "Now begins the second act. Tears pleading. I gave you the best years of my life." "Boredom." Stanley chuckled, swirling his glass. "Well, let her speak her mind, Ray. A woman needs to let off steam. Maybe offer her a sedative." Lucille heard every word. Before, these phrases would have wounded her to the very heart. Now they bounced off her like peas off a wall. She walked right up to the table. Vance, noticing her, lazily turned his head. In his eyes, irritation mixed with disgust could be read. "Lucille, don't make a scene," he hissed, not even trying to move away from Vanessa. "Everything is already decided. My lawyers will contact you tomorrow. Go sleep it off. You look terrible." Vanessa stopped smiling and stared curiously at Lucille, assessing her rival. There was no fear in her gaze, only the cold calculation of a predator looking at a wounded animal. Lucille didn't answer. She slowly raised her left hand. Her fingers no longer trembled. She grasped the gold band of her ring. It fit tightly, grown into the skin over half a century, but now it slid off surprisingly easily, as if it wanted to leave the finger itself. The room became completely quiet. Even the music seemed to sound muffled. All eyes were glued to her hands. Lucille placed the ring on the snow-white tablecloth right in front of Vance's glass. The gold hit the table with a dull thud. The sound was quiet, but in the ensuing silence it sounded like a gunshot. The ring lay on the white fabric, small, shiny, and absolutely alien, like a bullet extracted from a wound. Vance frowned, looking at the ring. "And what is this gesture?" he snorted. "Think I'm going to cry? Keep it. Pawn it when the money runs out." The sons snickered, supporting their father's joke. Lucille looked up. Her gaze was dry and clear. She looked at her husband and, for the first time in 50 years, saw not the formidable head of the family but an aging, pathetic peacock so afraid of old age that he was ready to buy the illusion of youth at the cost of betrayal. "Clap louder, boys," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It rang out, filling the space of the hall, bouncing off the high ceilings. "Clap. You are so proud of your father." Raymond stopped laughing. The smile slid off Stanley's face. They felt something had changed. Their mother had never spoken in such a tone. There were no hysterics in her voice, no resentment. There was steel. "But know this," Lucille continued, and every word fell into the silence like a stone into water. "Your real father is sitting at the next table, right there." She didn't point with her hand. She just shifted her gaze. A deathly silence hung over the hall, so dense that it seemed one could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Guests froze with glasses in their hands. Vance slowly turned his head, following her gaze. Vanessa stepped back, feeling the situation spiraling out of control. The sons turned pale. Their faces, just full of arrogance, turned gray like ash. "Mom, are you drunk?" Stanley asked hoarsely, but fear was already ringing in his voice. "What are you talking about?" And then a man stood up. He had been sitting in the shadows at the farthest table, where distant relatives or insignificant acquaintances were usually seated. He rose slowly without fuss. He wore a simple not-new gray suit that had clearly seen better days. His face was weathered, his hands large and working class, with earth ingrained in the skin that no soap could wash away. "Arthur." He stepped into the circle of light from the chandeliers. He didn't look like a hero from a romance novel. He didn't look like a victor. He looked like a tired man who had carried an invisible burden on his shoulders all his life and finally got the chance to drop it. He walked toward the main table not as an invader but as a man who simply came to collect what was his. In his eyes, the color of dark amber, there was no gloating, only infinite, deep sadness and calm. He looked not at Vance, not at the sons. He looked only at Lucille. The guests parted before him, not understanding why themselves. A strange strength emanated from him, the strength of the earth, the strength of truth that needs no embellishment. Vance froze like a pillar of salt. Red blotches appeared on his face. He recognized him. Of course he recognized him, the gardener. The very gardener who had worked on Lucille's parents' estate half a century ago. The one he had always considered dirt under his feet. "You." Vance wheezed and his voice cracked. "What is this? What is he doing here?" "Security." But the security didn't move. The scene was too surreal, too powerful for anyone to dare interfere. Arthur approached and stood next to Lucille. He didn't touch her, didn't take her hand, just stood nearby, shoulder to shoulder, and that was enough. For the first time in 50 years, Lucille felt she was not alone. Raymond finally found the power of speech. He stepped forward, clenching his fists. His face was distorted with rage. "Mother, have you completely lost your mind?" he yelled, spraying saliva. "You dragged this old man here to disgrace father? You're saying that this laborer is our father?" Lucille looked at her son. In his eyes, those same amber eyes she saw every day and was afraid to admit their color, hatred now splashed. But now this hatred didn't frighten her. It liberated her. "Look in the mirror, Raymond," she said quietly. "Or look at him. Look closely." Arthur raised his gaze to Raymond, and at that moment the resemblance became obvious, frightening, irrefutable. The same shape of the eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same wide cheekbones which on Vance were narrow and aristocratic. Raymond froze as if he had hit an invisible wall. He shifted his gaze from Arthur to his mother, then to his brother, then back to Arthur. His world, built on pride and a sense of superiority, developed its first still thin but irreversible crack. "It's a lie," he whispered, but there was no confidence in his voice. "This can't be." "It can," Arthur answered calmly. His voice was deep, slightly raspy. Nothing like Vance's tenor. "Because it is true." Vance suddenly laughed. It was a dry, barking, terrible sound that gave the guests goosebumps. He laughed, looking at his wife, and there was something insane in that laugh. "Well, finally," he squeezed out through the laughter. "Finally, we stopped playing this comedy." Vance continued to laugh, and this sound, resembling the cough of an old crow with a cold, echoed through the hall, reflecting off the crystal pendants of the chandeliers. He looked neither shocked nor crushed. On the contrary, he seemed to have thrown off the mask of the noble patriarch, and beneath it was revealed the face of a bored cynic. "You thought this was a bomb, Lucille?" he asked, wiping away a tear caused by laughter. "You thought I'd faint or challenge you to a duel?" He swept his gaze over the frozen guests, then looked at his sons, who stood pale as sheets, and finally fixed his eyes on his wife. "I always knew, since the very day Raymond was born." Lucille felt the ground disappear from under her feet. She expected fury, denial, scandal, but she didn't expect this. "You knew," she whispered. Her voice trembled. Her entire plan, all her sacrifice, her whole life built on keeping this secret. suddenly seemed like a house of cards collapsing from a light breeze. Of course I knew, Vance snorted, pouring himself some water. His hand didn't shake. In our family, my dear, everyone is born with gray eyes. Always. And here are two brown-eyed sturdy boys. And that gardener of yours who was always hanging around the fence. You'd have to be an idiot not to put two and two together. And I, as you know, am not an idiot. Then why? Burst out Stanley. He looked at his father with horror, as if seeing a ghost. Why were you silent for 50 years? Why did you raise us? Why did you give us your name? Vance shrugged as if speaking about buying bad stock. Because it was profitable for me, Stan. Your grandfather, Lucille's father, gave such a dowry for her that I was able to save the family business. If I had divorced, I would have lost everything. And later I liked the role. Father of two sons, a strong family traditions, it sells perfectly. Investors love stability. He turned to Lucille, and his face twisted into a grimace resembling a smile but full of venom. But the funniest thing isn't that, Lucille. The funniest thing is that you're standing here all in white playing the victim. I kept a secret. I suffered. But you stayed with me for the exact same reason. Lucille wanted to object, wanted to scream that it was a lie, that she stayed for the children, for their future. But the words stuck in her throat. You are just as vain as I am. Vance continued, ruthlessly driving in every word like a nail. You were afraid of becoming a nobody, a divorcee with two bastards from a gardener. In the 70s they would have eaten you alive. Your parents would have kicked you out. You chose comfort. You chose the name Holloway. You chose this house, these receptions, these silks. We are the same, Lucille. We both sold our souls for a pretty picture. Only I at least honestly admit that I'm a scoundrel, and you lie to yourself that you're a holy martyr. These words hit Lucille harder than any slap. Everything inside went cold. She looked at Arthur. He stood nearby, not interfering, but in his gaze was such pain, such understanding that she wanted to fall through the earth. He knew. He also understood everything and still waited for her for half a century. Vance was right. The terrible bitter truth she hid in the darkest corner of her heart suddenly came out into the light. She really was afraid, not only for the children. She was afraid for herself, afraid of losing status, afraid of judgment, afraid of poverty. She sacrificed her love to her fear and called it a mother's duty. She looked at her sons, at these grown, strange men whom she had created with her lie. Raymond stood breathing heavily. His face had turned purple, veins on his neck bulged. He couldn't bear that his world, the world of a crown prince, the world of the chosen one, turned out to be a fake. All his pride, all his arrogance was based on emptiness. His father was not a tycoon but a gardener. His last name was a stolen mask. Shut up, roared Raymond, addressing Vance. Shut up. It's all a lie. He turned sharply to Arthur. Madness flared in his eyes. He needed to destroy the source of this pain, destroy the evidence of his inferiority. You, he croaked, pointing a finger at Arthur. It's all your fault. You poisoned our lives. Get out of here. Raymond lunged at Arthur. It was a movement of despair. Clumsy, furious. He swung, aiming his fist at the face of the old man who simply stood and watched. The guests gasped. Someone screamed. Lucille jerked to shield Arthur but wasn't fast enough. Arthur didn't move from his spot. He didn't even raise a hand for defense. He simply looked into his son's eyes, directly, calmly, without fear. Raymond's fist froze an inch from Arthur's face. Raymond looked into the eyes of the man he was about to hit and saw himself. It was like an electric shock. The same amber flecks in the iris, the same shape of the eyelids, the same deep, slightly sad gaze that Raymond saw in the mirror every morning when he shaved, and which always seemed foreign to him against the background of Vance's cold gray eyes. He looked into the face of his biological father and saw his own aging. He saw what he would become in 30 years. Raymond's hand trembled and dropped helplessly. He recoiled as if burned. No, he whispered, backing away. No, it can't be. Stanley walked up to his brother and grabbed him by the shoulder, but he himself didn't take his eyes off Arthur. Now that the truth had been voiced, it was impossible not to notice the resemblance. We are nobodies, Stanley said quietly. There was no anger in his voice but devastation. We aren't Holloways. We are nobodies. Vance watched this scene with a glass in his hand, like a spectator in a theater. Why nobodies? He remarked venomously. You are the sons of an honest laborer. You can go dig garden beds now. You can't crush jeans with a finger. Lucille looked at her children, crushed by the truth she had hidden for half a century. She wanted to approach, hug them, comfort them as in childhood, tell them it didn't matter, that they were still her beloved boys. But she didn't move because she understood that comfort now would be a lie. And there was already enough lying in this hall. They had to go through this themselves, and she did too. You aren't nobodies, Lucille said firmly. Her voice cut through the silence. You are my sons and Arthur's sons. And if the name Holloway is more important to you than the truth, then I feel sorry for you, because that name, as you just heard, is worth exactly as much as was paid for it. Nothing. Raymond looked up at her, full of hatred and tears. I hate you, he spat out. You destroyed everything. You made us a laughingstock. Lucille withstood that gaze. It hurt unbearably, but she didn't look away. I destroyed a lie, Raymond, she answered. And what you build on the ruins depends only on you. At that moment the hall doors opened again. But it wasn't a guest or a waiter who entered. It was Vance's lawyer, Bernard, a balding man with a folder of papers, who was clearly late for the start but arrived just in time to witness the finale. Vance, seeing him, perked up. Ah, Bernard, come in. Come in. He waved his hand as if nothing had happened. Just the time to sign papers. Since we've opened all the abscesses here, let's finish with the formalities. Let my ex-wife take her things and ride off into the sunset with her gardener. Lucille shifted her gaze to her husband. There wasn't a drop of warmth left in her eyes. You're right, Vance, she said. Let's finish, but I'm afraid it won't be me who has to leave. Bernard, a lawyer with eternally sweaty palms and shifty eyes, froze in the doorway, instinctively pressing the folder to his chest like a shield. The atmosphere in the hall was so thick with hatred and shock that it seemed one could cut it with a knife. The guests, feeling that the spectacle was shifting from drama to thriller, began to hastily retreat. Someone mumbled apologies. Someone simply disappeared, leaving unfinished glasses. In 5 minutes only they remained in the huge hall, the fragments of the Holloway family, the silent Arthur, and the confused lawyer. Bernard, why are you standing there like a statue? Barked Vance, trying to regain control of the situation. Give me the papers. Let her sign the waiver of claims, and let's be done with this circus. But Bernard didn't move. He shifted his gaze from the pale, shaking Raymond to the petrified Stanley, and then to Lucille, who stood in the middle of this chaos with frightening calm. Raymond suddenly woke up. He rushed to his mother, grabbing her hands. His fingers dug painfully into her forearm, but Lucille didn't even wince. Mom, tell me this is a joke, he hissed in her face. His breath smelled of alcohol fumes and fear. Do you understand what you've done? Tomorrow the whole city will know about this. They'll destroy us. Partners banks, they'll just smear us. Take back your words. Stanley jumped up. His face glistened with sweat. Tell everyone you went crazy. That it's silly hysterics. We'll hire doctors. We'll fix everything. Just take your words back. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They didn't ask how she felt. They were saving their own skins, their status, their cards to elite clubs. Lucille gently but firmly freed her hands from her eldest son's grip. She stepped back and sat in a deep velvet armchair standing by the fireplace. She smoothed the folds of her dress, looked at her sons, and suddenly realized she felt nothing for them but pity, that same squeamish pity with which one looks at a crushed insect. Where was that motherly love that forced her to endure humiliation for half a century? It had vanished, burned in the fire they themselves had kindled. Before her stood not her children. Before her stood the decay products of a rotten system. Weak, cowardly men who, without the name Holloway, were empty space. I won't be taking anything back, she said quietly. The truth has been spoken, and you will live with it. Live? Squealed Vance. What are you going to live on, you fool? I'll throw you out of here without a penny. You think I'll give you even a dime after this? You'll die under a fence with your gardener. He turned to the lawyer. Bernard, confirm the prenuptial agreement. She leaves with nothing. Bernard coughed nervously, adjusting his glasses. He finally approached the table but looked not at Vance but at his papers. Vance, he began uncertainly. The situation is somewhat more complex. What the hell do you mean complex? Roared Vance. I don't pay you for complexity. This house is mine. My accounts are mine. Lucille raised her head and met her husband's gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a tired statement of fact. Vance, did you forget 1974? She asked. Did you forget who exactly insisted on a strict prenuptial agreement? Your father. He was so afraid that a penniless daughter-in-law would snatch a piece of your fortune that he prescribed a separate property regime for everything acquired before marriage or received as an inheritance. Vance froze. Something resembling panic flickered in his eyes. So what? He snapped. I earned all this. You earned the money, Vance, Lucille continued calmly. But this house, the Charleston estate, did you forget whose it was? She swept her hand around the hall. My father, Nicholas Sterling, bought this land and built this house in 1968. He gifted it to me for the wedding, executed the deed personally to me so that, God forbid, your creditors couldn't take it when your business was shaky in the 90s. Remember? Silence hung in the hall. Even more terrible than before. Vance turned pale. He remembered. Of course he remembered. Back then it seemed like a genius move, hiding assets in the name of a wife who would never dare make a peep. And not just the house. Lucille's voice sounded even like a sentence. The land, the stables, the guest cottages, even the art collection my father gathered all his life. All of it is my personal property under your own contract. She turned to Bernard. Am I right, Bernard? The lawyer swallowed convulsively and nodded. Absolutely right, Mrs. Holloway. According to Section 4.2 of the prenuptial agreement and the property deeds from 1995, the estate is your sole property. Mr. Holloway has the right of residence only with your consent. Raymond and Stanley stood with their mouths open. Their world was collapsing, not brick by brick but by entire floors. So, Stanley stammered, we were homeless. You are grown men, Lucille answered coldly. You have your own apartments, your own cars, but this house is mine, and I don't want to see people in it who despise me. Vance grabbed his chest. It was theatrical, but there was real fear in his eyes, fear of losing the scenery without which he was nobody. You wouldn't dare, he wheezed. Lucille, come to your senses. 50 years exactly, she nodded. 50 years, I endured enough. You have 1 hour to pack your things. And then happened what put the final period in this farce. Vanessa, Vance's young mistress, who had stood aside all this time watching the collapse of an empire, suddenly came to life. She understood everything instantly. Her sharp predator's mind instantly calculated the debit and credit. An old husband, 2 grown, hysterical stepsons, a scandal across the entire city, and most importantly the absence of the main prize. The house, this luxurious palace, for the sake of which she tolerated Vance's senile hands, didn't belong to him. She didn't need an old bankrupt beggar. She silently took her purse from the table. Nessa. Vance turned to her seeking support. Nessa, tell her. Vanessa looked at him the way one looks at empty space. Sorry, Vance, she tossed indifferently, but I don't need problems. I didn't sign up for a commune with your ex-wife. She turned on her high heels and clattered toward the exit, not even looking back. The door slammed shut behind her with a dry click. Vance was left standing alone in the middle of the hall, without a wife, without a house, without a young mistress, and without the respect of his sons, who now looked at him not as an idol but as a loser who had lost everything. Lucille didn't even smile. It wasn't funny to her. She just felt nothing. She shifted her gaze to Arthur. He still stood aside, calm and unshakable as a rock. He didn't rejoice in Lucille's victory. He just waited for her to finish taking the trash out of her life. Get out, Lucille said quietly. What? Asked Raymond, not believing his ears. Get out of my house, she repeated louder, rising from the armchair. All 3 of you. I give you an hour. If you aren't gone in an hour, I'll call the police and report trespassing. Bernard will confirm my rights. She turned and walked toward the exit to the terrace, to where the fresh air was. She needed to breathe. And here in this hall it smelled of decay. Lucille didn't make it to the terrace doors. A heavy hand landed on her shoulder, turning her around, but not roughly as before, but somehow fussily, ingratiatingly. Vance stood before her. His face had lost all its arrogance. It had sunk in, aged 10 years in these 15 minutes. Animal fear splashed in his eyes. "Lucille, wait," he muttered, trying to look into her eyes. "We need to talk without witnesses. Let's go to the library, please." That please sounded so unnatural, as if he were speaking a foreign language. Lucille looked at his hand on her shoulder, then at Arthur. He nodded barely noticeably. "Go. I'm here." She silently headed to the library, dark, soaked in the smell of old leather and cigars, a room that had always been Vance's sanctuary. She was allowed to enter here only to bring tea or call him to dinner. Now she entered here as the mistress coming to inspect the property before demolition. Vance closed the heavy oak door behind them and leaned his back against it as if trying to wall himself off from reality. "Lucille," he began, and his voice trembled. "What is this scene you've created? What mistress? It's just a midlife crisis. A devil in the ribs. You're a smart woman. You understand everything." He took a step toward her, extending his hands. 50 years, Lucille. We've been through so much together. Are you really going to cross it all out because of one stupid speech? I was drunk. I wanted to show off. Forgive me. Let's forget this evening. I'll kick that girl out. I swear we'll go to Martha's Vineyard like you wanted. Lucille looked at him and felt a strange lightness. All her life she had been afraid of this conversation, afraid of his anger, his leaving. And now when it happened, she saw before her not a titan but a pathetic old man bargaining for his comfortable old age. "Sit down, Vance," she said quietly. He obediently sank into his favorite armchair. Lucille remained standing. "You think this is about the mistress?" she asked. "Or your speech?" "No, Vance, it's not about that." She walked to the window beyond which the ocean roared. "You talk about 50 years. Let's remember them. Remember 1982 when I broke my arm, supposedly falling down the stairs? You pushed me because I forgot to pick up your suit from the cleaners. Remember 1990 when you forced me to have an abortion because a third child wasn't in the budget, and a week later bought yourself a new Mercedes?" Vance winced as if from a toothache. "Why are you digging up the past? Let bygones be bygones." "I'm not digging," she interrupted him, not raising her voice. "I'm tallying the bill. I was your buffer, Vance. I softened your blows, both physical and verbal. I smiled at your partners whom you swindled out of money so they wouldn't sue us. I lied to the children that Dad is tired when you came home drunk and yelled at them. I erased you from their memory and painted you a new kind, smart, noble." She turned to him. "I did it not for you. I did it because I was afraid to admit that my life was a mistake. I was afraid to look in the mirror and see emptiness there. But today I looked, and do you know what I saw?" Vance was silent, looking at the floor. "I saw a woman I like. A woman capable of telling the truth. A woman you hate because she is stronger than you. I'm leaving not because you found another. I'm leaving because I finally found myself." The library door burst open without a knock. Raymond and Stanley stood on the threshold. They had already managed to recover from the first shock, and now their fear had transformed into aggression. "All right, enough poetry," barked Raymond, entering the room. "Dad, are you really letting her lecture you?" "Mom, let's get down to business. You said the house is yours. Suppose. But the money in Dad's accounts is ours. It's inheritance. And the business." Stanley chimed in. "The company shares. You have no right to them. We worked there for years." They stood before her, two grown men in expensive suits demanding their toys. They didn't even understand what had just happened. They didn't give a damn about the divorce, about feelings, about the truth of their birth. They needed guarantees that their trough hadn't slammed shut. Lucille looked at them with deep, all-consuming sadness. "You didn't understand anything," she said. "Understood what?" snapped Stanley. "That our mother slept with the gardener." "Thanks. We got it. Now let's discuss compensation for moral damages." Lucille shook her head. "I gave you a name," she uttered slowly, weighing every word. "I gave you an education. I gave you a start that millions of people can only dream of. I lied for you for 50 years. I sold my conscience so you could feel like princes." She paused. In the room only Vance's heavy breathing could be heard. But I can't give you a soul, boys. I don't have that, and neither it seems do you. Don't you dare lecture us, Raymond flared up. You are a traitor. You betrayed father, betrayed the family. You are a liar. I gave you everything I had. Lucille interrupted him, and metal rang in her voice. I have nothing more for you. No money, no house, no sympathy. She walked to Vance's desk, took a heavy paperweight, and moved it a centimeter to the right. This small, possessive gesture enraged Raymond more than any words. You'll regret this, he screamed, clenching his fists. You'll die alone. No one will bring you a glass of water. Traitor. Lucille looked him straight in the eyes. Before she would have cried, before she would have rushed to comfort, justify, beg for forgiveness. But now she looked at him like a stranger being rude in line. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Get out, she said simply and quietly. What? Raymond was taken aback. Lucille raised her hand and pointed at the door. Her finger didn't tremble. Get out of my house, all three of you. Time is up. Vance raised his head. There was pleading in his eyes. Lucille, where will I go? It's night outside. To a hotel, Vance. You have money. You said it yourself. You earned it. So go spend it. She turned away to the window, letting them know the audience was over. Behind her back, she heard the shuffling of feet, the angry sniffing of her sons, and her husband's heavy sighs. They were leaving, expelled from the paradise they themselves had turned into hell. When the door closed behind them, Lucille leaned her forehead against the cold glass. She didn't feel the joy of victory. She felt as if she had just buried 3 close people. But along with the grief came relief. The air in the room became cleaner. She was alone. And for the first time in 50 years, this loneliness didn't frighten her. Promise peace. But the silence didn't last long. The library door swung open again, this time with a crash, hitting the wall so hard that several books fell from the shelf. Vance returned, but not alone. Behind his back, shifting from foot to foot, stood Samuel, an old friend of the family and a well-known lawyer in the city, whom Vance had apparently called in panic right from the parking lot. The sons loomed in the hallway, ready to support their father in the final attack. Vance looked furious. Fear had given way to that same vicious, rat-like aggression that wakes up when a beast is cornered. You think this is the end, Lucille? He hissed, poking a finger at her. You think you can just throw me out on the street? Samuel, tell her this is emotional abuse. This is driving someone to a heart attack. We'll sue you until you're left without pants. We'll declare the deed of gift invalid. We'll prove you are incompetent. Samuel, a heavy-set man with a kind, tired face, stepped forward. He took off his glasses and began wiping them with a handkerchief, clearly feeling out of place. Vance, he began softly. Calm down. We won't solve anything by shouting. Don't solve. Act, squealed Vance. You're the best lawyer. Destroy her. Find a loophole. Say she's crazy, that she forged the documents. Lucille stood by the window without moving. She looked at Samuel. They had known each other for 30 years. She remembered how he cried in her kitchen when his first wife left him. She remembered how she helped get his mother into the best clinic when she had a stroke, and how she drove homemade broths to her herself because Samuel had a difficult trial. Samuel put on his glasses and looked at Lucille. In his eyes were embarrassment and respect. Vance, he said firmly, turning to his friend. I won't take this case. Vance choked on air. What? You're betraying me? After everything I did for you. I made you who you are. You gave me work, Vance, the lawyer answered calmly. But Lucille saved my mother. When I didn't have money for the surgery, she sold her earrings and gave me the necessary sum anonymously. I found out about it only a year later. Lucille blinked in surprise. She thought he would never find out. I won't fight against her, Samuel finished. And I don't advise you to. She holds all the cards. The deed is flawless. The prenup, which you forced her to sign yourself, plays against you. Any court will take her side. Accept it. Vance froze with his mouth open. His last weapon had misfired. He turned to his sons seeking support, but they looked even more pathetic than he did. Raymond, realizing the legal path was closed, decided to play on a different field. He stepped into the room, putting a mask of tragic grief on his face. "Mom," he began, and his voice trembled, this time almost sincerely. "Okay, fine. Dad is guilty. We are guilty. But think about the family, about the legacy, the Holloways. It's a brand. It's history. Are you really prepared to destroy everything we built because of resentment? This house is a symbol. We can't lose it." "Yes," Stanley chimed in. "We'll make a museum or a foundation here. We'll preserve grandfather's memory." "Mom, don't be selfish. This is our ancestral nest." Lucille listened to them and shook her head. They still hadn't understood anything. For them, the ancestral nest was simply expensive real estate, an asset status. They didn't remember how she planted roses here. They didn't remember how her father built this house with his own hands, dreaming of a big, friendly family, not a corporation of monsters. She walked to the table, opened a drawer, and took out a folder of documents. "You talk about legacy?" she asked, placing the folder before them. "About symbols?" She opened the folder. On top lay a sales contract signed with today's date. "I sold the estate," she said calmly. Silence hung in the room, making ears ring. "What?" whispered Vance. "I sold the house and the land," Lucille repeated. "The deal closed this morning. The new owners move in next week." You couldn't?" Raymond grabbed the papers. His hands were shaking so much the pages fluttered. "To whom? For how much? The money. Where is the money?" "The money will be in my account tomorrow," Lucille answered. "I'm transferring half the sum to a foundation helping victims of domestic violence, the very shelter Vance tried to close last year to build a parking lot on its site." Vance turned green. He remembered, that was his little victory, crushing charity workers with administrative resources. He had bragged about it at dinner, how cleverly he pulled it all off. "And the second half?" Stanley asked greedily. "What about the second half?" "And the second half is my pension," Lucille chuckled. "I bought myself a small house far from here, and it will be enough for a comfortable old age. You won't get a penny of this money." The papers fell from Raymond's hands and scattered across the floor. This was the end, complete, unconditional collapse. The Holloway legend turned out to be a soap bubble that burst, leaving only a wet spot. Vance slumped into the armchair, covering his face with his hands. He was crushed, not by the divorce, not by the loss of his wife. He was crushed by the fact that he had been outplayed. The very gray mouse he had despised for half a century turned out to be a grandmaster who checkmated him in 3 moves. The sons stood looking at their father with undisguised hatred. Now that it was clear there was no money, and wouldn't be any, their respect evaporated. "Old fool," hissed Raymond. "It's all your fault. You played the patriarch too long." "Let's get out of here," Stanley tossed, turning around. "There's nothing left to catch here." They left, not even saying goodbye to their mother, just stepped over the scattered papers and walked out, leaving their father alone in his defeat. Lucille looked at Vance. She didn't pity him. He got exactly what he deserved. Loneliness amidst the wreckage of his ego. "Goodbye, Vance," she said. She took her purse and headed for the exit. The hall was empty. The guests had driven away. The servants had hidden. Only Arthur stood at the front door. He hadn't left. He was waiting. When Lucille approached him, he didn't speak platitudes, didn't congratulate her on the victory. He saw what that victory cost her. He saw how her hands trembled, how pale her face had become. He simply held out his hand to her, palm up. It wasn't a marriage proposal. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was the hand of a friend. The hand of a person ready to offer a shoulder when the ground disappears from under your feet. "Let's go, Lucille," he said quietly. "I'll drive you." Lucille looked at his hand. Rough skin, calluses, scars from working with the earth. The hand of a living, real person, not a master of life, not a manipulator, just a human. She placed her palm in his. His fingers closed, warm and reliable. She didn't fall into his arms. She didn't cry. She simply used his hand as a support to take the first step into a new life. They walked out of the house together. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind their backs, cutting off the past forever. Ahead was a night full of stars and the smell of the ocean, which for the first time in 50 years seemed to her the smell of freedom, not a prison. 6 months, 182 days. Exactly that much time had passed since that evening when the Holloway legend crumbled to dust under the ring of a gold band on a table. Lucille sat on the porch of her new house. It was a small cottage drowning in greenery hundreds of miles from the city. Here there were no marble floors, crystal chandeliers, or endless corridors where the echo of loneliness walked. Here it smelled of wood, dried herbs, old books, and silence. Real living silence. Not the kind that presses on the ears in an empty mansion when you are afraid to take an extra breath so as not to disturb the master's peace, but silence in which you can hear the wind rustling in the foliage, a bumblebee buzzing over a rosehip bush, an old floorboard creaking underfoot. Lucille set aside her cup of herbal tea and looked at her hands. On the ring finger of her left hand, a pale stripe was still visible, the trace of the ring she had worn for half a century. The skin there was thinner, tender, as if under the golden shell it hadn't had time to harden like the rest of the hand. That scar would probably remain forever, just like the memory. She didn't become happy overnight, as in fairy tales. Freedom turned out to be bitter to the taste. The first month she woke up at night from nightmares, grabbed the phone to call her sons, but every time she pulled her hand back. They didn't call once. Raymond moved to Atlanta trying to start some business, but rumors said he went bust. Stanley stayed in the city, got a job as a manager in some firm, and they say he started drinking. They couldn't forgive her for the truth. It was easier for them to live with hatred for their traitor mother than to accept the fact that their blue blood turned out to be ordinary human. They chose the lie. They remained Holloways, even when only dust remained of that name. Lucille grieved for them. She mourned those little boys with scraped knees whom she once rocked in her arms. But she accepted the men they had become. She realized she couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. The gate in the garden creaked. Lucille raised her head. Arthur was fussing by the fence, fixing a leaning picket. He was in his unchanging worn jacket with a hammer in his hand. He came to visit her a couple of times a week, helped around the house, fixed the roof, mowed the grass. They didn't live together. Lucille told him right away. Arthur, I can't. I was someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's shadow for 50 years. I want to be myself. Just myself. And he understood. He didn't pressure, didn't demand, didn't rush. He was just there. He came silently, did the men's work, drank tea with her on the porch, and drove back to his small apartment on the outskirts. Lucille looked at his broad back, at the gray hair tousled by the wind. Did she love him? She didn't know. That crazy youthful fire that was there in 1974 was gone. Only warmth remained, deep, calm warmth like from a cooling stove, and gratitude that he waited, that he didn't judge, that he was the only one who saw in her not a function but a human being. Arthur finished the work, wiped his hands with a rag, and walked up to the porch. There you go, Lucille, he said, smiling into his mustache. Now it won't fall over. It'll stand for another 100 years. Thank you, Arthur. She smiled back. Sit down. The tea is still hot. He sat on the porch step, not daring to take the armchair next to her. He still kept his distance, giving her as much space as she needed. They sat in silence, watching the sunset. The sun painted the sky in soft pink and gold tones. No dramas, no scandals, just evening, just life. You know, Arthur, he suddenly said, looking at his hands, back then at the wedding I thought you wouldn't go through with it. I thought I'd just come, look at you one last time and leave. I thought so too, Lucille answered quietly. I thought so for half a century, and then I realized that if I didn't do it now, I'd die without ever having started to live. He nodded, understanding. And the boys, he asked cautiously, haven't called. Lucille shook her head. No, and they won't. They chose their path. I let them go. That was the hardest part, letting go. Stopping blaming myself for how they turned out. Stopping trying to fix the past. Arthur finished his tea, put the cup on the railing and stood up. Well, I'll get going, Lucille. Bus comes in 20 minutes. Go on, she nodded. Thank you. He lingered for a second as if he wanted to say or do something, but only waved his hand and walked to the gate. Lucille watched him go until his figure disappeared around the bend in the road. She was left alone again, but now this loneliness wasn't empty. It was full. It was her own. Lucille picked up a book from the table. It was a volume of poetry she had loved in her youth. the one Vance had once called depressive trash. She opened it at random. The pages smelled of old paper and time. She began to read aloud, quietly for herself. I've learned to live simply and wisely, to look at the sky and pray to God, and to wander long before evening, to tire my useless anxiety. Her voice sounded confident and calm. For the first time in 50 years in the room, in the house, in her life, only her own voice sounded. And no one interrupted her. No one winced. No one demanded she shut up. She closed the book, placed her hand on the cover and took a deep breath. The air smelled of mint and freedom. Life hadn't ended. Real honest life was just beginning. And let her be 70 years old. She had this sunset. She had this tea. She had herself. And that was enough.